How bullets kill. How bullets stop a threat. That's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, where we tackle this topic and hopefully many more in the future the right way, with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience on that: military, law enforcement, private security, contracting. Been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country. Anything from whitetail on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast, elk and bear. Been blessed to be a guide and professional hunter, firearms instructor, state rifle and pistol champion a few times over, and a bunch of other stuff that's in the bio. Been a professional gunfighter most of my adult life, hence the title of the show. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. With that, I mention that because I want to bring real-world first-hand experience to the gun community. That's one of the reasons I started the podcast, a main reason I started it. Let's cut through the marketing hype. Let's talk about what's actually important and what's not really important. Because as much as marketing hype would pump it up, ballistic coefficient doesn't kill animals, period. And unless you get to the ridiculous, it's largely irrelevant. That's not the point of today's show. It's just an example of how marketing hype has gotten so ridiculous as to be impractical. But let's talk about how bullets kill, shall we? Or how they stop a threat, depending on your goal. The two big questions one should ask, well, let's start with three. Biblical Judeo-Christian values. Taking life should not be taken lightly. Taking an animal's life, we're called to be good stewards, right? Now, I'm not for Orwellian newspeak. I'm not for, let's call it harvesting an animal or whatever. I slay beasts and put them on a table to feed my family, and I don't apologize for that. We're called to have dominion and rule over. That said, I've taken the lives of many animals, and I don't take it lightly, and I don't think you should either. Taking a life is a weighty matter. That's an animal life. A human life, the only reason to ever take a human life is that the alternative is worse. To not take that life would be worse ramifications than taking the life. Human life is a precious thing. How much more value are you than a sheep? Are you than many sparrows? The Bible says your life is not the same value as a sheep or a goat or a deer. You're much more valuable. Stopping a human threat, which may result in death, should absolutely not be taken lightly, and you should have a biblical grounding in when you can do that. So let's get back. 3 questions. Should I even be shooting this thing? This living thing? If so, what is my target? Like, what is the thing that I'm shooting, and what am I trying to accomplish? Right, if we are talking about shooting a big game animal, hopefully our goal is to end its life quickly with a minimal amount of suffering so that we can eat it and consume it as a blessing from God to make us stronger and wiser men and women. That's our goal. If we're defending life, our goal is to stop that threat, to change that person's bad behavior, whatever behavior that was, to make me start shooting them in the first place, to end that behavior. That would be a goal. So what is the target and what is the goal? Right, there are some other goals that we might have for taking a life, like if you trap mice in your house, your goal is to get rid of a pest because you don't want them eating your food because they carry diseases. They're a rodent. They're an unclean animal. Right? I've done pest control for like ranchers. If I'm issued a damage stamp to take out prairie dogs because they have the Black Plague and they tear up ground and do all kinds of things. And that cattle rancher is trying to make a living, right? That will be a different goal. That will be outside of this. But consider the target, right? The target of a prairie dog is a far different thing, and I want the bullet to accomplish the bullet's going to have to be far different, generally, different parameters than taking an elf on the hoof. So what is my goal here? We should start out with that. Now, how do bullets kill or stop a threat? I don't want this to be taken lightly, and I don't think that we're just, cosmic stardust or even animals that are just randomly here by time and chance and stupid garbage religion of evolution. I think we were put here for a purpose. That said, not to be taken lightly, but if we look at, mammalian body construction as a system, taking the spiritual aspect, putting it on a table, not that it's not important, but we're talking about the physical stop of an animal, of a mammal, generally, right? Unless you live in like South Florida and you're hunting iguanas or something. But you have a central nervous system, and you have a vascular system, you have a heart, and you have lungs. Those are pretty much what's germane for today's topic. Yeah, sure, you could hit something in the liver and it could die pretty quickly, but that's not a goal of ours. That's not like we're not aiming for a liver, right? That would be a pretty poor choice. So, central nervous system, CNS, and the cardiopulmonary system, like arteries, heart, lungs. That's what we need to disrupt to do enough damage to achieve our goal. Our goal of putting meat on the table or stopping a threat. For this, as far as handguns are concerned, we need penetration. For any firearm, whether it's a handgun or a shotgun or a rifle, we need penetration. Until you get into the realm of like vehicles, which can be a far more deadly weapon than a gun. So anyway, I'm going to get off that soapbox. But you hit somebody with an F-150, you don't need penetration. You could not penetrate their skin at all and still kill them. But as far as firearms go, firearms don't have that much energy. If for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Without penetration, if the gun was powerful enough to kill something without penetration, then it would kill you when you pulled the trigger. The difference is that recoil is distributed through the entire firearm and, the entire back of the stock and you holding the gun and into your body as opposed to the very tip of the bullet. Even for something, people think like it is a heavy hitter like a 300 Win Mag. You put that amount of energy in a vehicle and it hits you, it's like 2 miles an hour. It's not going to do any damage because there's no penetration. So in the realm of firearms, you need penetration. How much penetration? Enough to get into those vitals, that central nervous system or that cardiopulmonary system, to rapidly decrease the hydraulic pressure, right, the blood pressure, to get into those vitals, the chest cavity, the brain, the brainstem, the spinal cord. You need enough penetration for that. Depending on your shot angle. Now, if it's stopping a threat, stopping that bad behavior, you're probably not going to be able to pick that angle. You might be like, well, yeah, of course they'll be coming straight at me if it's a threat. Well, no, not, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. What if they're attacking your neighbor with a machete? That shot angle, you might have to go through, their arm twice, go through their forearm and their upper arm, and then into their chest cavity, wearing, some layers of clothing from the side. So no, it may not be always straight on. Again, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. What if they're attacking your neighbor? So you likely won't get to pick the shot angle. Now in hunting, you can choose to pick the shot angle. You can just let many animals walk, which I have done. Like with certain calibers, with certain animals, you may only want to take a broadside shot. Like I hunt, and I have hunted elk with a 243. Yeah, and I've taken elk with a 243. That said, I limit myself to an acceptable range, and I pretty much keep it to a broadside shot. Does that mean that's the only the only angle I would shoot an elk at? No, but it means with that caliber, with the bullet that I was hunting with, that was the shot that I was comfortable taking, a broadside shot. Why? Because I don't have to, and I was competent enough in my shooting ability to put it behind a shoulder, right? With a larger caliber, I wouldn't mind if I hit a shoulder, a scapula or whatever. But with a 243 on an elk, I'm not comfortable doing that. If I was shooting, a 30-06 with a, 180 grain nozzle partition, I'd be totally fine taking an angling shot, either, forward or aft. I would be perfectly comfortable punching through a shoulder bone, but not with a 243. Why? Penetration, right? We need to get enough penetration, and with certain shot angles, 243 is certainly enough for elk, and certainly many elk have been taken with a 243 or a 30-30 or anything on the lower end, right? But you have to know that anatomy. You have to know how much that bullet's going to penetrate. So you need enough penetration. How much? What's your target? What's your distance? What's your energy? All that stuff, right? So you need enough penetration with ballistics to get the job done, to get the bullet where it needs to go. Now, I think people can get way too wrapped around the axle on both sides of this. Over penetration, you hear this in the defensive world so much it makes me want to throw up in my mouth a little bit. Over penetration. Getting back to like things outside of firearms, I can punch a hole through drywall pretty easily, right? Like most interior doors, I can bust a hole through. Funny story that kind of ties into this. I have a 118, 110, 120 pound, depending on whether that Rhodesian Ridgeback is in the rut or he's gaining some sympathy weight because my female is pregnant. But when she was in heat, he broke through, like bored a hole through an interior door, plowed through it to get to that female in heat. Right? And again, going back to, I can punch a hole through drywall. I can punch a hole through an interior door, kick a hole through an interior door. I cannot kick a hole through you. I cannot punch a hole through you. I don't care if you're a 110-pound Asian male. I can't punch a hole through you, and no human can. Why do I say that? Because any bullet that is going to reliably, repeatably, different shot angles, going through an arm, going through heavy clothing, any bullet that can do that is going to penetrate drywall. It's going to penetrate interior walls, unless your interior walls are made out of brick or something, unless you go to the ridiculous. So stop with the overpenetration. Worry about job number one first. Job number one is stop the threat. Don't be shooting, an intruder with birdshot. I have sadly seen what that does to a person, and it's not impressive. It's pretty miserable, not impressive, even at really close range. May it stop the threat? Yeah, if they decide to, but we're not talking about, I guess we should talk about that real quick. I went, when I talked in the beginning about stopping the threat. Now, you could shoot somebody with a BB gun that they think is a real gun, and they get hit and it hurts, and they're like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to play this game. I'm taking my ball and going home. That's a psychological stop. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about you need to stop the threat mechanically. Like they're on drugs. They're on the old Nazi cocktail, right? What was it, like an amphetamine plus a painkiller? And they're determined to kill you, and they don't even know what planet they're on. And they are going to do everything they can to kill you, and you have to stop them mechanically because they're not going to give up psychologically. That's the kind of threat we're, worst case scenario, dealing with. Now, if I shoot them once and it's not fatal and they decide to give up and stop that bad behavior, let's go back to what's my goal. My goal is not to kill the person. My goal is to stop that bad behavior. If I shoot them once and it's not even a life-threatening shot, but they decide to take their ball and go home, then let them. Your job is done there. Assuming they're not going to be a threat to somebody else in the immediate future, right? Fleeing felon and used to leave the force is a thing. But you get the idea. You get the point. That said, the overpenetration thing is so overblown. It's like the tactical equivalent of ballistic coefficient. It's so, retardedly overblown that it's ridiculous. Anything that's going to stop a threat mechanically is going to go through walls. Period. Maybe it'll break up. Yeah, if you use a super high velocity 223 frangible bullet, yeah, maybe it will break apart. But also maybe it'll break apart on that machete-wielding maniac with a Carhartt jacket before it reaches anything vital. Maybe it hits them in the arm and does tremendous damage and they psychologically stop, but getting back to what if they're on drugs and they don't even feel it? That's a real thing. So stop with the overpenetration. Worry about problem number one, hit the target, right? If you worry about hitting the target, you don't have to worry about what goes through walls. Then you worry about what's going to go through an entire human being and then go through a wall. Okay, that's what people hyperfixate on the one end. And then on the other end, people say in the hunting world, the bullet needs to go through any angle and go completely through the animal. Like if I shoot it directly head on or directly going away from me, it needs to go through the complete animal because I need 2 holes to follow a blood trail. That animal needs to bleed like a hog that I cut its throat and it's bleeding everywhere. I need that amount of blood to track that animal. This also, I think, is ridiculous. As somebody that tracks animals, as somebody that hunts, as a tracker, as a still hunter, as a stalker, if I can track that animal before it's even wounded, I should be able to track it if I made a good shot on it. Now, I can't say this for like a prairie dog or something, right? Because I've done like eradication. That's different when I'm shooting hundreds of prairie dogs. But as far as big game animals go, by God's grace, I don't believe I've ever wounded a big game animal, and I've taken a lot of big game animals. I don't believe I've ever wounded a big game animal and not recovered it. If I could track it before I shot it, why can't I track it after I shot it? Why do I need that bullet to go completely through both sides of the animal and spray blood like somebody's, put a paint can in a paint shaker without the lid on? Why do I need that? I don't think that I do, so I think that also is overblown. No, I'm not upset if the bullet goes through both sides of the animal, but many of the times I've shot animals specifically, and with the bullets that I've chosen, for it to go through and dump a massive amount of its energy inside the chest cavity of that animal. It's still going to bleed out of one side of the animal, probably, unless it's a big fat bear, which happens. So on that, let's talk about another thing. It needs to penetrate and it needs to do damage. It needs to dump energy. Not to be fatal, right? I could shoot something. I don't even know if they make 17 caliber full metal jacket ammo, but let's say that they did. Let's say a 17 caliber. Well, sure they do, right? They make pellet rifles, like they make air rifles that just have solid ammo. 17 caliber, super tiny projectile, super small, smaller than anything you're probably going to use for defense unless you're European, and that's like what you have because you've been so neutered and so infringed on by your government that now they're. I'm going to get off that soapbox, but outside of today's discussion, I'm going to. Anyway, a 17 caliber, super light, super small projectile that doesn't expand at all. You could shoot somebody and it gets just under the skin and it gets into an artery that then gets pumped into their heart or their brain and kills them. But let's not go to the ridiculous. Yeah, it's possible, but we're not talking about killing somebody. You could shoot somebody with a BB gun that just breaks the skin and they could get gangrene and die a month later. But that is not germane to your situation. Again, what's the goal? The goal is to stop the threat before they kill you or somebody else, which takes seconds or fractions of a second. Or your goal is to stop that animal with as minimal suffering as possible so you can recover it and eat it. If you shoot, a deer in the guts, it's probably going to die. A week later, 2 weeks later of starvation, which is miserable. You should be really upset about that. So yeah, you killed the animal, but you failed at achieving your goal, which was to, give as little suffering to the animal as possible and to put meat on the table for your family. You failed at that, even though the animal is dead. That's worse than not shooting the animal at all, right? So you need to dump enough energy into those vital areas to quickly do the damage. And this is where energy is important. We talked about penetration. We talked about energy. Now, energy is important as far as enough energy and disruption to do enough damage. And this harkens into bullet construction. And why this is important, way more than ballistic coefficient. When you spend your time thinking about what load you're picking out for most things, you should spend about 10 times more focused on the bullet construction and what that bullet's likely to do. And I say likely because there's a gray area in ballistics. What that bullet's likely to do in its intended target, you should spend about 10 times more focused on that than the ballistics coefficient. Because that's pretty much irrelevant. Unless you go to the ridiculous, right? Unless you're comparing like an ancient 45-70 at 500 yards to a super high BC target bullet. Yeah, if you want to get to the ridiculous, fine. But if you're talking about most modern cartridges, and I'm talking like, 1880s was when the 303 British came out. I would consider that a fairly modern cartridge. It's completely capable, although a bit dated. But let's go super modern, 1906, right? The 30-06. Anything like that, relevant or newer, with a modern Spitzer bullet. Once you get to that point, the BC doesn't really matter for practical stuff. Is it a boat tail bullet with a .5 BC or better? Who cares, dude? Who cares? My research that I've seen is that the boat tail bullet was developed for machine guns so that they were more accurate, transitioning that transonic barrier, which happens somewhere around 800 yards. I don't think it's ethical to shoot the animals that far away anyway. And you'd have a hard time, unless you're a military sniper, justifying that in any kind of defensive scenario. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's marketing hype. You're being marketed to so hard, and a lot of you are just taking it. Market me harder. So forget about that. And what this leads to, as far as today's discussion, is people will get this, they'll get this idea that this is important, and they'll go get a super accurate, like 6.5 Creedmoor, and they'll get 140-some grain bullets that are super high BC, that are target bullets that shoot little tiny cloverleaf groups, which that's all well and good, and that's fine if you want to shoot steel or you want to print tiny holes in paper, but then they'll think that automatically they're a deer sniper and it's ethical to shoot a deer at 500 yards with that ammo, when that ammo is designed for targets. It's a very thin jacketed cup and core bullet. I'm not saying it won't kill deer, but I'm saying it's a poor choice. You'd be better off, and I'm not the guy that hates 6.5 Creedmoor. I have one. One of the rifles I used guiding. But knowing game and knowing what's ethical, I generally run 125 grain game bullet, Winchester X point. But the BC's point something let. Who cares, dude? It's a good solid game bullet with a high enough velocity and enough penetration that's designed to do more damage inside the chest cavity of that animal than printing little teeny tiny bug hole groups or having a super high BC so that it drops an inch less at 500 yards, which who cares? What's important? And the bullet construction is 10 times more important. I'm not saying you can't kill a game animal with a matched bullet. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it in like an actual survival scenario where I'm going to die and that's all that I had. I would take that shot if I was going to die or my wife was going to starve to death with a full metal jacket if I had to. But that's a horrible choice. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. I could go find a beehive right now of Africanized honeybees and be like, I'm going to reach my hand in there and see if I can pull the queen out. There's no law against it, right? I probably could do it. It's a ridiculously stupid choice. Just because you can do something doesn't mean it's a good idea, doesn't mean you should, doesn't mean it's ethical, doesn't mean that it's wise. So what kills? Getting in far enough and doing enough damage. As predictably as you possibly can. Yeah, could you shoot that deer with a full metal jacket and could it just nick the top of the artery going into the heart and could it die very quickly? For sure, it totally could. Also, you could be an inch off for whatever reason. And the animal runs off and dies of a massive infection. Whereas even if you were an inch off and you had, let's say the old Remington Quarlock that's going to expand and do a lot more damage, doesn't really matter if you actually hit the heart or not. Could you, going to the defensive world, could you, run, and I'm not telling you to do this, could you run 124 grain NATO full metal jacket in your carry gun, and if you got into a shooting, could you shoot that guy one time and it hits him in the kneecap and it's extremely painful? You shot him in the right knee because you flinched low left and dropped one in his right knee because he's facing you, right? And it's extremely painful and he just grabs it and starts crying and decides he doesn't want to play anymore. Then you could be like, oh yeah, full metal jackets are 100% effective. That's not how that works, right? Or you could get the opportunity where you do a Mozambique drill super quick, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, and you drop one right in between that triangle between the orbital eye sockets and the nose, and he just lights out, getting into that central nervous system, in which case the full metal jacket is completely effective. That could happen. Also, you could get into where you have full metal jackets and you dump 5 rounds in his chest and he's still coming at you with, again, that machete-wielding maniac because he's on drugs and he doesn't realize he's going to die in a couple seconds. And a couple seconds is all he needs to kill you. So getting a bullet that does more damage is important. How does that happen? Expansion. Now, you can have too much of a good thing. Getting back to that highly frangible bullet. We're talking about doing eradication on prairie dogs. One of the bullets I love for that is a varmint grenade. Loading, let's say, a 223 varmint grenade, 36 grain at over 3,000 feet a second. It's a frangible bullet. It's like a jacket of bullet with powdered metal inside of it. It's super lightweight, super high velocity. It explodes prairie dogs, which is what I want. I want to minimize that animal's suffering. I want that animal to be dead as quickly to instantaneous as I possibly can. It has inches of penetration. Massive expansion, minimal penetration. That's not going to be enough penetration likely for a deer, for a human, right? So I have to balance that because there's a balancing act there. Anytime I increase the diameter of that bullet, which is what expansion is, I decrease its ability to penetrate. We go to the extreme, a varmint bullet, super high expansion, super low penetration. If I go to something more applicable, like a Spear Gold Dot, one of the reasons the 9mm is the de facto handgun caliber of our day, when it honestly wasn't so stellar decades ago, is because they've kind of got that formula right. They balance the expansion with the penetration, at least in carry size, man size handguns, a full size fighting handgun that you carry on your hip. Not a little baby #MeToo gun, but in a full size fighting handgun, 9mm does pretty good because you can get enough penetration to get into those vital areas, and you can get enough expansion to disrupt that tissue. Barrel length plays into that. Velocity plays into that. You need enough velocity to make that bullet expand. Case in point, if I take that Spear Gold Dot and smash it on the table with my hand, I'm not going to make that bullet expand. I need enough velocity to get that done. So if you shoot it out of your little #MeToo 2-inch barrel gun and it's designed for a fighting handgun, even if it's a good projectile, it may not expand because it doesn't have the velocity to expand, in which case you're basically shooting a full metal jacket. PCCs are so hot right now, I think because they're cheap and they look really cool on Instagram because you can shoot really fast, right? But let's say you put that really good made-for-a-duty handgun hollow point into your PCC, it could overexpand, right? It could expand too quickly, kind of like a varmint bullet, or come apart and lose its integrity, in which case you might not get the penetration that you need. It could hit somebody, again, wearing a Carhartt jacket and it has to go through their lower arm and their upper arm, and then it doesn't get into the vitals. And they're still wielding that machete. You've just made them switch hands is about all. So you could, by putting that same round into a longer barrel, get too much velocity and the round overexpands. This is important to understand. BC, not really. For practical stuff, if you want to, shoot, a steel barn door at 1,000 yards, then it's important. If we're talking about putting meat on the table ethically or stopping a threat, not important. If we get to that bullet construction being 10 times more important, even with the same caliber. So let's take a .30 caliber, America's caliber, right? A caliber is a bullet diameter, not a cartridge. There's a lot of different cartridges in .30 caliber, which is the point of this section of this discussion. I could have the same, because I could load a 150 grain bullet in a lot of different cartridges. I could have a 150 grain bullet designed for the 30-06, 2,900 feet a second. That's a pretty vanilla load, 150 grain 30-06. It could be a Remington Core-Lock, legendary big game hunting round for deer and even larger than deer size animals. 150 grain Remington Core-Lock. You could be like, I'm a 180 grain dude. Okay, forget about it. We're talking about this discussion. I don't think anybody would argue that 150 grain Remington Core-Lock is a bad choice for deer hunting. That bullet performs really well at that task. If I take that same bullet and load it into a 300 Blackout, it likely is not going to perform very well because it doesn't have the velocity to expand. Right? You're talking way lower velocity. Now, 150 grain and 300 Blackout is still going to be supersonic, but it's going to be pedestrian compared to the 30-06, which is not exactly a screaming cartridge. Right now, they probably even make a Core-Lock for a 300 Blackout, but I'm going to venture a guess that it's constructed differently, even though it might be similar, same caliber. It's probably constructed very differently than the one for 30-06. Now let's go to another extreme. Let's say that we are going to load that 150 grain bullet in a 300-378 Weatherby Magnum. You might be looking at high 30s, maybe 4,000 feet a second. I don't know. I'm just guessing, just based on the case capacity in my brain. You're talking about way more velocity than the 30-06. Well, that bullet might come apart. It might be going so fast that it loses its integrity, and you shoot an elk on the shoulder, and it gives it the front leg, and it gives it a nasty wound, but it fails to penetrate and do damage to the central nervous system or the cardiopulmonary system. Even though it's the same bullet and it's got way more energy than it would out of a 30-06, but you would actually have been better off shooting that elk with a 30-06. Because, again, you have to balance that. You didn't get enough penetration because you had so much velocity, the bullet lost its integrity and came apart. And when a bullet comes apart, each individual section of that bullet has less ability to penetrate. Maybe that's what you want. Again, if you're shooting a prairie dog, no problem. The vitals are like an inch inside. If you're shooting an elk quartering towards you, that's a problem. So bullet construction is important. Now, there are things you can do to mitigate that. You could shoot a solid copper bullet, which maintain their integrity generally at much higher velocities. You could shoot a bonded bullet like a Nosler AccuBond or a Nosler Partition, or a really good controlled expansion bullet if you wanted to push it at screaming high velocities. But you may actually get a less dramatic kill with that bullet, even though it would be perfectly fine for killing a white-tailed deer, than you would with a simple, let's say, Walmart load, going back to that cup and core, 30-06 150 grain Core-Lock. Despite the Magnum marketing hype, 30-06 is more than enough for deer. Not saying it's a bad round for deer, but you have more than sufficient energy. If you pick a wise bullet, you have more than sufficient energy with a wisely constructed bullet to shoot deer or elk or insert animal here. So, getting back to the overarching theme of this, should you be shooting this thing in the first place? Are you confident you're going to hit your target, right? It's the hits that count, not the noise you make, not the likes on Instagram. It's the hits that count. Should you be shooting that thing? Can you hit that thing? Consider the target and what is the goal? What do you want that bullet to do when it gets there? I don't think any of this is really new. I mean, certainly not new, but I mean, even to this podcast. I've talked about this stuff before, but maybe it's just one of those things where this time it clicks. This time you get it. Because human life is precious, and even animal life should not be taken lightly. It's not to the degree of a human life, but even that, I don't want animals to suffer. I want you to be a good ethical hunter. I want you to be able to defend yourself, your family, your fellow man, your neighbor as yourself effectively. For those reasons, I think this is important. With that, I'm also going to say that there's a gray area in ballistics. Bullets can do some really weird things that you would not expect. That you can mitigate that, but I don't think you can ever fully negate that. Even with a really wise caliber choice, a really wise bullet choice, sometimes bullets can just do a weird thing through no fault of your own, but you can minimize it. Getting back to that, I don't advise elk hunters, right? If I'm guiding you, I don't advise you take a 243 for elk. I think that's more of an advanced hunter's cartridge for elk if you wanted to use it. And even then, you got to be judicious about your shot placement and your choices. You might have to let several elk walk. But getting back to that, weird things can happen. I'm comfortable with that round behind the shoulder, where the biggest thing it has to go through is a rib bone on a broadside shot. Now I could shoot an elk quartering to me, and it could, with a decent bullet, punch through the shoulder of that elk. It could also deflect and go at some weird angle, come out the top of the animal because it, hit shoulder bone and went out at a 9-degree angle. And maybe that only happens, a small fraction of the time. But why take that shot? Again, if it's survival, which very few of us hunt for actual survival nowadays, but if it was survival, again, your life is more valuable than an elk. But if it's sport hunting, which we're relegated to because of the government nowadays generally, should you be doing that? Again, there's a gray area in ballistics. Bullets can do weird things, so try to mitigate that as much as possible. All right, with that, your tactical tip of the day. In order for you to get that bullet on target, that bullet has to feed in your gun, right? So let's get back to carry guns. Don't be the guy that, trains with Winchester White Box 115 grain. There's nothing wrong with that ammo. It's good ammo. It's good training ammo. But don't be the guy that trains a bunch with 115 grain Winchester White Box, and then you load up 135 grain plus P Hornady truncated cone. Nothing wrong with that practice ammo. Nothing wrong with that duty ammo. It's a good load. They're both good loads for their intended purpose. But don't assume because your gun feeds the 115 grain ball that it's going to feed the 135 grain truncated cone. It may not feed it at all. You may get malfunctions. It may chew big chunks out of the side of the bullet just in feeding. You have to test it. The ammo, in order to hit its target, has to actually feed into the gun. Don't trust your life to something unproven. So actually make sure your carry ammo works in your gun, not just practice. And also it has to hit the same point of aim, point of impact, which those two loads are likely to not. But make sure your ammo that you're not betting, but that you are trusting your life to and other people's lives to, it's a better way to put it. Make sure it actually feeds in your gun, not just theoretically, but like when you're admin loading it, but like when you're shooting under stress, maybe one-handed. Make sure it feeds in your gun, right? Yeah, carry ammo is expensive, but compared to like life insurance, not really that expensive. Test your carry ammo. You may realize an omission. I did not talk about vengeance when I talked about why are you trying to stop this threat. You're stopping it because it's a threat, because it's doing a bad behavior that's possibly going to cause death or serious bodily injury to you or another. You're not doing it for vengeance, which leads us into today's tactical verse of the day. O Lord, to whom vengeance belongs, O God, to whom vengeance belongs, shine forth. Okay, it reminds me of another verse, as verses often do. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. That's not your purview. It's God's job to deliver vengeance. It's not your job to deliver vengeance. If you have to, like an example I've used in the past, and I'll use again. Like if I'm in a movie theater and a bunch of Islamic jihadists come in and, start killing people in that movie theater, the most loving thing I can do for my neighbor at that time is to probably do a Mozambique drill, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, into that, Muslim that's trying to cut off Christians' heads or take an AK to them. That's the most loving thing that I can do. At that point, the most loving thing that I can do is take that person's life because it saves the lives of many others. But that's not vengeance. Right? That's not vengeance. So, give vengeance to whom it belongs, to God. That's his purview, not ours. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.